Hello and welcome. Today we're going to tackle a question that seems pretty simple on the surface, but believe me, it's a real can of worms. Can you actually test someone's medical English in a way that's separate from their general English skills? The answer has been a puzzle for experts for decades, and today we're going to unpack why. Okay, so let's dive right in. The big question is this: can you really isolate something like medical English and test it separately from a person's overall command of the language? I mean, it seems like common sense, doesn't it? A doctor and a lawyer, they obviously use English in very different ways. But here's the critical question we have to ask. Is that a fundamental difference in the language itself? Or is it a difference in their specialized knowledge?
Now, there's a formal name for this whole concept: Languages for Specific Purposes, or just LSP. And you know, this is not a new idea by any stretch. It's got a really long history, from specialized German courses for chemists way back in the day to the kind of phrase books travelers have been using for centuries. It's all built on this very practical, very real observation that people need language to get specific things done in specific situations.
This quote, wow, it really gets to the heart of the matter. Way back in the 60s, anthropologist named Charles Frake pointed out that knowing perfect grammar just wasn't enough to, say, get a drink in a particular community. You had to know the social rules, the right way to ask in that specific context. And this became a foundational argument for LSP. The idea that being fluent isn't just about grammar books, it's about knowing how to actually operate in a particular world.
So to really wrap our heads around this, linguists make this really important distinction between user and use. A dialect, that's tied to the user. You know, where you're from, your social background. It's basically different ways of saying the exact same thing. But a register, that's all about use, what you're doing at that moment. Think of registers like different outfits you wear. You wouldn't wear your beach clothes to a board meeting, right? Well, in the same way, you don't use the language of an operating theater when you're ordering a coffee. LSP is basically the study of these specialized outfits of language.
So, the logical next step for researchers was to try and pin down exactly what makes these registers unique. And early on, they took a very quantitative approach. They'd grab a huge stack of scientific articles and just start counting things. How often the passive voice popped up, the frequency of certain technical words, the kinds of verb tenses. The hope was that they'd find this distinct linguistic fingerprint, that the data would just reveal what makes scientific English what it is.
But here's the crucial point, and it was made by the hugely influential linguist H.G. Widdowson. He argued that just counting words was totally missing the point. It was missing the forest for the trees. This kind of analysis could tell you what was written, sure, but it couldn't tell you why it was written that way. It couldn't get at the communicative purpose, the real logic of the conversation. The difference wasn't just in the words, it was in the meaning people were trying to build with them.
And this brings us to the first major crack in the whole theory of LSP, what we call the boundary problem. I mean, think about it. If these specialized languages are real, distinct things, you should be able to draw a nice, neat line around them. But when you actually try to do that, those lines get incredibly blurry, incredibly fast.
This is just the perfect illustration of the problem. Let's take medical English. Is it just one single thing? Absolutely not. It bleeds over into chemical English the second you start talking about pharmaceuticals. And then, internally, it just shatters into a million little pieces. The way a surgeon talks during an operation is totally different from how a pediatrician talks to a worried parent, which is different again from how a researcher writes up a study. So where does one specific purpose actually end and the next one begin?
So, this leads us to this really powerful counter-argument. What if what makes medical English so specific isn't a unique version of the English language at all? What if it's just plain old English plus a massive amount of specialized subject matter knowledge? In other words, to understand what a surgeon is saying, maybe you don't need to know surgical English, you just need to know English, and you need to know a whole lot about surgery. And that completely shifts the focus from language skill to content knowledge.
Now, I want to be clear. This isn't just some abstract academic debate we're having. Oh no. These theoretical problems have had massive, real-world consequences. And there is no better case study for this than the story of one of the world's biggest and most well-known language tests, IELTS.
Let's just walk through this timeline because it tells a fascinating story. The original test back in 1980 was pure LSP theory in action. It had 6 different subject-specific modules. But pretty quickly, by 1988, a huge report comes out saying it's deeply flawed. So the test gets a total redesign, it becomes IELTS, and they cut the modules down to 3. And today, the main academic test has just one single general module. The entire history of IELTS is a slow, painful retreat from the idea of specific purpose testing.
And this quote, right here, this is the smoking gun. For those of us in the language testing field, this was a landmark moment. The people who wrote the report, Cripper and Davies, they concluded that the test itself was actually well made. The problem was much deeper. The very theory that you could neatly slice and dice language into these separate, testable, specific languages was flawed. The test didn't work because the idea it was built on just wasn't sound.
And on top of all these deep theoretical issues, the test was, frankly, a practical nightmare. It was a logistical beast, and the candidates themselves were totally confused. How are you supposed to choose a module if your field, something like architecture, falls smack in the middle of 2 categories? And even worse, the candidates felt it was just plain unfair. There was this famous complaint from a student that just captures it all. This test is unfair. I'm not an economist. They felt their English score was being tanked not by their language skills, but by their lack of knowledge about economics. They felt they were being tested on content, not on communication.
So this brings us to a really fascinating puzzle, right? If the underlying theory is this shaky, and a huge real-world application of it basically failed, why do we still have so many tests for business English, aviation English, or medical English? Why didn't this whole idea just, fade away?
Well, the answer seems to lie in this incredible split between theory and practice. On one side, you have the theory, which, as we've seen, is pretty weak. The research shows that these specific tests don't actually predict success any better than a really good general proficiency test. But on the other side, you have the practical reality. And the idea survives on what we might call critical common sense. It just feels right. It has high face validity, which means it looks like a good test to the people taking it and using the scores. Engineers want a test of engineering English. Doctors want a test of medical English. It inspires confidence. It motivates people, even if the theoretical foundations are basically built on sand.
And so this leaves us with the critical question, the one that everyone in language assessment has to wrestle with. When we design and use these specific purpose tests, what are we really measuring? Are we actually getting a pure look at someone's ability to communicate in a specific world? Or are we just accidentally creating a subject knowledge test in disguise, where your score depends more on what you know about the topic than how well you can actually communicate? That right there is the dilemma at the very heart of testing languages for specific purposes.